When most of us picture Cornwall, we picture a holiday. Fishing villages and cream teas, surfers on a long Atlantic beach, the gentle make-believe of a costume drama filmed against the cliffs. We do not picture an industrial empire, and yet for the better part of a century, one corner of this county was the white gold capital of the world. By 1910, the district around a single Cornish town was producing half of all the china clay on earth, roughly 1 million tons every year, 3/4 of it shipped out across the oceans. The wealth was enormous. So was the wound. The same digging that made the fortunes raised white mountains of waste so vast they buried the natural summit of the moor, turned the rivers the colour of milk, and left behind a landscape so strange that the BBC twice used it to stand in for the surface of another planet. This is St Austell, the town that was made, and then unmade, by the same white earth beneath it. To understand what happened here, you have to first see what most visitors never stop to look at. Driving towards St Austell from the holiday coast, you pass a horizon that does not belong to picture postcard Cornwall at all. Pale, sharp peaks rise out of the moorland north of the town, gleaming a strange, dirty white against the grey Cornish sky. People mistake them for snow or for natural hills. They are neither. They are spoil, the leavings of an industry, and they are the most honest monument the town has. Because the story of St Austell is not the story of a city destroyed in a single afternoon by a bomb or a flood. It is a slower and crueler kind of destruction, one with no clean before and after. Here the wealth and the wound were never two separate things. They were the same act, repeated for 200 years, until the money left and only the wound remained. It began with a man who walked. William Cookworthy was a Quaker, an apothecary and minister born in Devon in the early 1700s, the son of a weaver, and so poor as a boy that when he was apprenticed to a chemist in London, he is said to have walked the road there around 200 miles because he could not afford the coach. He grew into a curious, careful mind, fascinated by the secret the Chinese had guarded for centuries, the recipe for true white porcelain. The English could not make it. Their earthenware cracked and yellowed, and the gentry paid fortunes for imported china, while their own potters failed. Cookworthy believed the missing ingredient was a particular kind of clay, and in the mid-1740s on a hillside in West Cornwall he found it. A few years later he found far larger and purer deposits near St Austell. The miracle material turned out to be something humble, almost to the point of absurdity. It was rotted granite. Feldspar in the Cornish stone decayed over unimaginable time into a soft white powder finer than talc. In 1768 he patented his method and opened a porcelain works. But the Staffordshire potters, led by Josiah Wedgwood, fought his monopoly and broke it, and once the patent fell, the whole of the pottery trade was free to come to Cornwall and dig. The rush was on, and William Cookworthy, the man who had unlocked all of it, died without ever growing rich from what he found. What he had found, though, would make others rich beyond reckoning. Through the 1800s, the pits multiplied across the moor, and the scale of it became almost difficult to believe. By the middle of the century, thousands of men were already working the clay around St Austell. By 1910, as we have said, this one district produced half the world's supply, and the use of the clay was quietly changing under everyone's feet. It had begun as the stuff of fine teacups, the white heart of Wedgwood and Spode and Minton. But the largest customer soon became paper, where china clay was used to fill and coat the glossy sheets pouring off the world's presses, and in time it found its way into paint, into rubber, into medicine and cosmetics, even into the toothpaste in the bathroom cabinet. The men who controlled it built dynasties. In 1919, the three biggest producers merged into a single giant, English China Clays, which held around half the industry's capacity and would dominate Cornwall for the rest of the century. You can still see where the money went. A few miles from the pits sits Charlestown, a perfect little Georgian harbour of stone quays and tall-masted ships. Before the clay, it had been a fishing hamlet called West Polmere, home to a grand total of 9 people. A local landowner named Charles Rashley poured a fortune into turning it into a working port, and it swelled into a town of thousands. Its sheds crowded with boat builders and rope makers and lime burners, its dock packed with vessels carrying the clay away. It is so well preserved that today it earns its keep pretending to be the 18th century for film cameras. The clay paid for churches and chapels and a brewery that still bears its founder's name. And it shaped a whole way of life on the moor above. A world of Methodist chapels and brass bands and Sunday school outings, of mine captains who preached on Sundays, of clay workers famous for their strength who were said to shift 20 tons of sand a day by hand. Those men knew their worth. In 1913 they walked out in a great strike, nearly 5,000 of them, and marched through the streets of St Austell demanding their share of the wealth they were pulling from the ground. But here is the part of the story the postcards leave out. Every ton of that white gold came at a terrible price, paid in white waste. The usable clay was only a fraction of what had to be dug. For every single ton of clay, the pits threw up somewhere between 5 and 9 tons of sand, rock and mica, useless spoil that had to go somewhere. And so it went up. Across the moorland, the waste rose into vast pale cones, conical white mountains that the locals, with grim affection, came to call the Cornish Alps. They dominate the skyline for miles. They are so white that travellers really do mistake them for snow in midsummer, and they grew until they did something almost mythological. The natural high point of this country is Hensbarrow Beacon, a summit of 312 metres, a genuine Cornish mountain crowned with an ancient cairn. The waste tips climbed past it. The tallest of them reached 355 metres, an artificial summit 43 metres higher than the highest ground nature had made. The industry had quite literally built a mountain taller than the mountain. It poisoned the water too. The rivers ran white, thick with the milky run off of the clay washing, and the main river through the town earned a name that has outlived the industry. They called it the White River. When it reached the coast, it turned the sea itself pale, and people who grew up here remember swimming in milky water and watching the beaches whiten. The land took on the look of somewhere that was no longer quite of this earth, and the world noticed. Television crews came to the worked-out pits and found a ready-made alien world, and so the moonscape around St Austell was filmed as the surface of distant planets, first in Doctor Who, and later in the BBC's Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Today, some of the flooded pits hold pools of an unreal turquoise, beautiful and faintly wrong. But the strangeness had a human cost that was not beautiful at all. The clay dust got into men's lungs. Surveys of the workforce found widespread pneumoconiosis, the scarring of the lungs that comes from breathing mineral dust year after year, the body slowly stiffening from the inside in payment for the white gold. And so we come to the part where the wealth begins to drain away, because for all the scarring, Cornwall was not running out of clay. It still is not. There is something like another century of it in the ground beneath the moor. What undid St Austell was not exhaustion, it was the rest of the world. Far away in the Amazon basin of Brazil lay enormous deposits of high-quality clay that could be dug far more cheaply, and in the American state of Georgia lay more. Slowly, then quickly, the foreign clay undercut the Cornish. The economics were merciless. Brazilian clay was sold in dollars, so a weak dollar made it cheaper still, and for years the only real protection Cornwall had was the simple cost of shipping clay across an ocean. At the same time, the bills at home were rising, because Cornish clay has to be dried, and drying is hungry for energy, and energy was becoming expensive. The paper industry began swapping China clay for cheaper ground chalk, and the machines that made the pits more efficient needed fewer and fewer men to run them. The peak had come in 1988. After that, the long, quiet slide began, and everyone who worked the clay could feel the ground shifting beneath them. Then came the takeover and the fall in earnest. If you are finding this story as strange and as moving as I do, take a moment to subscribe, because this channel exists to tell exactly these forgotten chapters of British history, the towns and trades that built the modern world and were quietly broken by it. Now let us follow St Austell down. In 1999, English China Clays, the great Cornish giant, was bought by a French minerals company that renamed itself Imerys in a deal worth £756 million, and with the company came its remaining workforce of around 2,000 people. For a while the work continued, and then it did not. The numbers tell the shape of the collapse with brutal clarity. At its height, the industry had employed something like 13,000 people across Cornwall and Devon. By the decade from 2010 to 2019, that figure had fallen to around 900. The defining blow landed in 2006, when Imerys announced around 800 redundancies in a single stroke, closed the historic port at par to commercial shipping, and began shifting its paper clay production to Brazil. The work was not ending. It was simply leaving, sailing away to where the digging was cheaper, and taking the livelihoods with it. To understand what that meant, you have to understand what those jobs were in a place like this. They were not the lowest paid work in Cornwall. They were the best work there was. When the politician who represented these villages stood up in Parliament to plead for them, he explained that the clay jobs paid an average of around £23,000 a year in a borough where the average income was only around £18,500. These were the good jobs, the steady, full-time, generations-deep jobs, in a corner of England that had little else. He warned that in some clay villages, as many as one household in 5 was about to lose a full-time wage, and closer to 1 in 3 once you counted the knock-on effects. He himself lived in one of those villages, a place called St Denis. Years later, when a further round of cuts came, another local member of Parliament described what had happened to the clay communities in a single quiet sentence that lands harder than any statistic. In the old villages, he said, there had been a transition from generations of families working in the same industry to a generation of families not working at all. That is the wound that does not heal in a film clip. The clay had been more than an employer, it had been an identity, handed from father to son for 200 years, and when it left, it took the future with it. The town that had once produced half the world's white gold now holds, by the most recent census, the second most deprived neighbourhood in the whole of Cornwall, where well over half of all households live with at least one serious form of deprivation. And then, as if the place had not lost enough, came a second wound, smaller, but somehow crueler in its irony. In an effort to revive the dying town centre, a large new shopping development was built and opened around 2009, and they named it, of all things, after the polluted river. They called it White River Place. It was anchored by a large discount store, and in 2023, that chain collapsed nationally, leaving the flagship of the town's revival with empty units staring out at the street. The river had been named after a wound. The shopping centre had been named after the river. The symbolism was not subtle. And yet this is not quite where the story ends, because the land itself has refused to stay dead. The most famous answer to St Austell's decline rose fittingly out of a grave. A few miles from the town lay the exhausted Bodelver pit, worked for around 160 years until there was nothing left to take, a barren crater sitting below the water table. A man named Tim Smith, fresh from restoring a lost Cornish garden, looked into that hole and saw something nobody else could. With the architect's help, he filled the pit with vast, bubble-like greenhouses and a living global garden, and in March of 2001, the Eden Project opened to the public. In its first year alone, it drew 1.2 million visitors to a place that had been a wasteland. It became the symbol of what Cornwall could be after the clay. But even Eden has felt the long Cornish gravity. Its crowds have thinned in recent years, falling to around 543,000 visitors in a recent year, a long way down from those opening crowds. Meanwhile, out on the moor, Imeris has been quietly spreading soil over the white mountains its predecessors raised, coaxing heather back onto the slopes, turning the Cornish Alps slowly back into Cornish heath, as though the company were trying to bury its own monument. Which brings us to the strangest twist of all, and the one that is still unfolding as you watch this. Beneath the very same ground that gave up the China clay lies another white metal the modern world is desperate for. Lithium, the element at the heart of every electric car battery. For a few hopeful years it looked as though history might rhyme, as though St Austell might rise a second time on a new white gold pulled from the same Cornish granite. A project was launched near the old clay country, promising battery-grade lithium, hundreds of jobs, enough material for 500,000 electric cars a year. They called it Cornwall's Revival, built on its centuries-old mining heritage, and then, in February of 2026, the company placed the British lithium project into what it calls care and maintenance, suspending the work to focus its money on a more advanced project in France. No restart date was given. The new white gold, for now, has been left in the ground. So this is what is left of the white gold capital of the world. White mountains slowly turning green. A river named for the colour of its poison. A shopping centre named for the river. A wonder of the world growing in an exhausted pit. And a second fortune in the rock that the town has been told, once again, it cannot have yet. For 200 years, St Austell sent its wealth out across the oceans, through the harbours it had built, and kept only the waste. The fortunes sailed away, the white tips stayed, and the town that fed half the world's appetite for white gold is still standing among the leavings of it, looking up at those pale artificial mountains, and waiting for the earth beneath it to finally pay back what it took. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the forgotten industrial towns that built Britain and were broken by it, the next one is already waiting for you on screen.